Hello and welcome back to The Professor Speaks. I'm Raphael Chacón, Director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, and also Professor of Art History and Criticism at the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana, in the Western United States. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to our series on Rome and the early Christian period. And what we're doing is we're looking at this, the rise of this great empire, and today its collapse, and also the advent of Christianity as a major faith. And of course, we're looking at this through the lens of art history. So we're looking at monuments from works of art, from sculptures, paintings, to architecture and urban planning. So today we have a tall order. We're going to be talking about the last great emperor of the Roman Empire, and that is a man by the name of Constantine, also known as Constantine the Great, a man who figures not just as important, significant in Roman history, but also very important to the Christian faith. And so we'll talk about Constantine very shortly. So let's go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint presentation and begin our conversation about Constantine. So apologies if this lecture runs longer than typical. Of course, as I mentioned, we have quite a bit to discuss. So we start our conversation with the collapse, if you will, of the Tetrarchy. And remember that, that Rome had been divided into four quarters, four very, very large regions, and each was ruled by a different individual. So in 305, Diocletian, Emperor Diocletian, and Maximian abdicated, and they replaced themselves with two individuals, Constantius Chlorus in the west and Galerius in the east. These two became the new Augusti. Constantine was the son of Constantius Chlorus. So that's an important detail right there, that he is in fact the heir to the initial Tetrarchy. And Maxentius was the son of Galerius. So Diocletian and Maximian placed their sons in their seats of power. They became the new Caesars in the second Tetrarchy, which didn't last long because, of course, in typical Roman fashion, the competition heated up between these rulers and another civil war ensued. But Constantine emerged victorious from that battle, ultimately dissolving the second Tetrarchy and becoming the unified emperor, but not before having to wage war in order to concentrate his power and to win the support of the empire as a whole. So back to his history, he was born in around the year 280. We don't know exactly when, and as I mentioned, he is the son of Constantius Chlorus. We know that he served with Diocletian in Egypt and also with Galerius in Persia. Galerius, who would rule in that Eastern Empire. He was hailed as the new emperor in 306 upon his father's death in York, England. And he ruled from Trier. So remember that the Western Empire was ruled out of the northern lands of Germania, so in Trier, Germany. And then eventually he goes to war with the other tetrarchs. So he executes Maximian in 310. And in 312, he has a definitive battle with Maxentius, the son of Galerius. He defeats Maxentius in a very famous battle known as the Battle of the Mulvian Bridge. In a minute, I'll show you some images related to that. But for now, it's important to note that the Mulvian Bridge was at Rome's northern gate. Maxentius died in that battle. And as far as Constantine goes, there's an anecdotal account of his victory. One is that he had a dream in the nights before going to battle against Maxentius. In that dream, he saw an enormous red cross in the heavens and a voice that said to him, "In hoc signo vinces," which is Latin for "by this sign ye shall conquer." And the sign, of course, was a cross. And of course, if you remember, the cross was a method of execution used widely in the Roman Empire. Rome executed its enemies by hanging them from these wooden crosses. But by this time, by the 4th century, the early 4th century, the cross was now an indivisible symbol for this new faith that had emerged in the first century. And that faith, of course, was Christianity. It was a cult within Judaism. And again, if you remember, Judaism was one of the many religions of the Roman Empire. And this Jewish cult, basically surrounding the figure of Jesus, a man by the name of Jesus, an Aramaean by the name of Jesus, grew steadily within the boundaries of the Roman Empire from the first century into the fourth century. It was a powerful cult, a fast-growing cult early on in the life of Rome. Rome, in some ways, was threatened by Christianity, and as was Constantine and his predecessors. We know certainly Diocletian, one of his immediate predecessors, harassed and hounded and executed many, many Christians in the name of cohesion within the empire. And Christianity, you have to admit, was in fact a threat to the Roman Empire, not so much because the Roman Empire was intolerant of religion, but because Christianity was intolerant of Roman religion. It was intolerant of all other faiths, as a matter of fact. It did something socially that really upended the Roman social order. And that is that it allowed and encouraged people of all classes, plebeians and aristocrats, plebeians and members of the highest classes, to actually to converge around the rituals and the ceremonies and the Christian faith. All worshipped one deity, all worshipped and all respected the teachings and lived by the teachings of Christ, this Jew, and but across social classes. And that was something that was that the Romans couldn't tolerate. Remember that this was a highly stratified society. Classes needed to stay in their place. To a certain extent, women and men had to stay in their place. But Christianity, in some ways, plowed through that and created a kind of equal opportunity religion, which allowed anyone, just about anybody, to sit next to someone of a different class. So in some ways, that was the largest threat of the Christian community within the Roman Empire. It wasn't so much that Christians were intolerant of the Roman gods, which they were, or in fact opposed the authority of the state, which many did, but it was really the fact that it had the potential, and it did, of upending and conflicting with the values of Roman society. That is, the organizing principles that held the society together. So in 313, Augustus, who was now emperor, issued what is known as the Edict of Milan, and he did this with Licinius, who was another ruler. And then in that Edict of Milan, he made Christianity, or they made, I should say, Christianity a religio licita, which means a licit religion. It was one of the many hundreds of cults within the Roman Empire, which were in fact legal. And that, of course, made the Christians a group that had been harassed and had been suppressed by the Roman Empire for centuries now, a legal religion. And that legal status allowed them to openly worship, to gather, and to promulgate their faith, which they did with zeal and abandon in this 4th century. So Constantine, by the way, Christianity holds him as the first Christian emperor, and many people were in fact convinced that he had converted himself to Christianity. Scholars today are rather skeptical of that, and many in fact have argued that he understood the power of this faith and this community within the empire, and in some ways appeased the empire by sort of throwing some gifts their way. And but we don't know to what extent he actually believed in any of the teachings of Christ, or believed that Christ was the one true deity, the only path to heaven. Some would argue that he maintained the Roman state religion for his entire career up until his death, that he continued to fund the construction and reconstruction of temples and maintain those priesthoods. So what kind of a Christian would actually do that if in fact they had converted to Christianity? Nevertheless, we do know that he began to work with the Christian community and in fact favored it to a certain extent. Okay, so In 323 to 24, Constantine becomes the sole emperor, and he in fact is considered a reforming emperor, and curbs corruption, strengthens the borders against the barbarians, and then eventually establishes a new capital. We'll talk about that later in this lecture. In 325, a council took place in Anatolia, in Asia Minor, in the city of Nicaea. And it was there where the Christian patriarchs, the fathers of the faith from all around the Mediterranean gathered. And this is, in fact, the most important council in early Christian history. In 330, Constantine, by 325, he now had a new capital in Asia, moving the capital city from Rome to the east. And again, we'll talk about that very, very important and decisive move on his part. And then he renames that capital after himself in the year 330. So a man with no small ego. So the famous Constantinople, the city, the polis, if you will, of Constantine, Constantinople. And that, of course, is modern day Istanbul, the capital of the nation state of Turkey. And then 7 years later, he dies in Nicomedia, a resoundingly powerful and an important emperor in Roman history. So I'm showing you here some images of a colossal statue that was once in the Roman capital, in Rome itself, Rome proper. And you can see these fragments of this colossal statue, the very large head that you see there on the right and above. And here it is again, his hand, sort of the blessing with the finger raised high, and then his feet. And those are the fragments that we have in the Capitoline Museum, in the courtyard of the Capitoline Museum in Rome today, of this once colossal statue. More than likely, it was a seated statue that came from the Roman Forum, from an important temple there. So there are other images of Constantine, bust portraits like the one that you see there when he was a young man. This is, of course, before assuming the throne. And then some later images, some beautiful imagery of him, now kind of fictionalized much later in time. This comes from the very, very famous Christian church of Hagia Sophia in ancient Constantinople. And that is an image from the year 1000 that you see on the right. And of course, by now, Roman art has much devolved or altered, let's put it that way, changed. And so we have a kind of fictional image of Constantine as a Christian ruler. Notice that he's wearing, in fact, a crown, and he is haloed because he is now considered a saint within the Christian community. And that is some of the images that we have of the Emperor Constantine. There are also some wonderful imagery that develops later in the Middle Ages related to Constantine, this so-called first Christian emperor. This is a marvelous illuminated manuscript. So it is in fact on vellum, that is animal hide, painted by hand by monks in the 9th century. So this dates from about 879 to 882, and it is known as the homilies of Gregory of Nazianzus. And so beautifully painted images that kind of evoke now the echoes, if you will, of ancient Rome. So we have in these in the painting above, we have an image of Constantine at his bed. He is in fact dreaming, and what he's dreaming, of course, is he's having this vision in which the voice of God tells him, by this symbol, and of course the symbol is the cross of Jesus Christ, that place where he was in fact crucified or put to death by the Roman state. And then below that, you have this in the next register, you have this image of Constantine on horseback chasing his foes in civil war over the Milvian Bridge. And there above his head is in fact the great cross, that image that he had in his dream. The legend goes that he had his soldiers paint that cross on their shields, and that's what protected his forces from defeat from his enemies. So a wonderful page from the homilies of Gregory of Nazianzus from the 9th century. And then there are some fabulous imagery from the Renaissance and later periods that, of course, deal with this all-important chapter in Christian history. These are frescoes by the Italian Renaissance painter Giulio Romano. And we have at the left, the Constantine at the Milvian Bridge, of course, it's a battle scene, a Renaissance battle scene. So you have a multitude of figures engaged in battle, in war. And then on the right, you have the apparition of the cross. So there's Constantine there in this kind of golden outfit in front of his tent, in front of his soldiers and his troops, testifying, if you will, to the power of his vision and the cross which appeared to him in a dream before the great battle. So amazing frescoes. These were done by Renaissance artist Giulio Romano and Raphael, the famous high Renaissance artist on the right, both of them from the 16th century, and both of them in the papal apartments in the Vatican today. So still to be seen. By the way, in Giulio Romano's image, Constantine is wearing the golden outfit. He's not actually falling off that white horse. It's actually the white horse to the right. And there you see Constantine going off to battle with the standard, with the cross of Jesus on it. So, and let's go back here and talk a little bit about early Christian art. So we could call it early Christian art, or we could call it late Roman art. But what we have here is, in fact, remember, Christianity is emerging as a religion within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. And so in its early days, this cult of Judaism in some ways had to select that imagery which made sense to them, which fitted the narratives of their faith. And so I'm going to show you here a work of art that is indeed an early Christian work. It is a ceiling painting that dates from the early 4th century, and it is in fact in a set of catacombs. And if you remember from history, the catacombs were a series of underground tunnels and chambers that were carved out of the volcanic stone in the hills surrounding Rome, outside the city walls. This is where the Romans laid their dead to rest, literally carving into the stone and then painting, plastering the vaults and the walls and the spaces, the interior spaces of the chambers. This is a catacomb that comes from the early 4th century, so about the time of Constantine. And what it shows us is, in fact, a set of Roman images. We have, in fact, a vaulted room, so we have a hemisphere above the space, and there you see the places where the bodies could rest, and there are indeed some bodies in the catacombs of St. Peter and Marcellinus. And by the way, these are Christian saints, Peter and Marcellinus are early Christian saints, and they are buried here in these rooms. And then above you have these wonderful paintings. And what do these paintings reveal? Well, they show us some images out of the Jewish Bible. They tell, for example, in the center there you have an image of a good shepherd. You have an individual carrying a lamb on his shoulders with his flock in front of him. A nice Roman youth, painted in the Roman style, the late Roman style, of a young shepherd. And then surrounding it, you see other images. You see these lunettes. Here on the left, you have an image of a boat and someone being thrown off that boat, and then a kind of sea monster rising to receive that body. In the middle there, you have a nude figure lounging under a grapevine, a very common Roman subject in late antiquity. And then on the right, we have a scene that shows that sea monster spitting out the body that he just swallowed that was thrown off the boat. And in between these figures, and by the way, the fresco's damaged. We've lost another section of it here on the upper right. In between these figures, what you have are these orange figures. So figures holding their hands up in the air in a gesture of praise and worship. So, and by the way, these 4 images surrounding the central roundel form, if you will, a cross. And that should be the tip-off that the individuals buried here were Christians. So a subtle allusion to their faith in this cross shape. And then what about these Jewish stories? Well, these are the stories of Noah. And if you remember Noah from the Hebrew Bible, Noah was one of the prophets. He was an individual who was, in fact, God called him to service. And Noah, lounging under his vine, was resistant. But ultimately, he, in fact, does try to flee God. And while he's on a ship across the Mediterranean somewhere, the sailors become worried because of a storm that arises, and they realize it's because of Jonah's disobedience. And then Jonah is thrust into the sea, swallowed by the whale, and he lives in the belly of the whale for 3 days before he repents and the whale spits him out, and then he goes forth to proselytize for his God. Jonah is an antitype of Jesus. Jesus is, in fact, called by God. He's a son, but he nevertheless is called to serve, to make sacrifice, the greatest sacrifice. And he also spends a period of 3 days in darkness. And that is, of course, after he is crucified, he goes into the underworld, he goes to hell, consorts with individuals down there, and then he comes back in the form of resurrection. So Jonah is seen as a predecessor of Jesus, an antitype, and his story is a story about the resurrection of Christ, and ultimately the resurrection of all Christians in times to come. The praying figures that you see there with their hands up in the air are clear references to the Christian faith and the way that they worshiped, the way they sang, the way they prayed. So remember, this is a cult of Judaism that starts in the Near East, it starts in Palestine and migrates very quickly to the heart of the Roman world in that first century, where it in fact is established among Romans of all classes. So, and it diffuses itself there. And therefore, the individuals there begin to select images from the Roman world, stories from the Jewish world, stories from the Christian narratives, combining those with Roman imagery. And I'll show you some more of that. Here's a sarcophagus of a Christian, and it has images that any Roman would recognize as conventional Roman themes. By the way, notice the dumpy style. So Roman art has devolved here by the end of the 3rd century. It's no longer naturalistic. It's losing that naturalism, and yet all the parts are there. We see, for example, a good shepherd there. We see a sitting philosopher. We see an orange figure praying. And then we see Jonah and and the whale, the dragon that you see there, and the ship, and his vine, etc. So what is happening here is that these early Christians are borrowing images from the Roman world and then giving them a new context. And that context is the Jewish myths, the Jewish stories. And then they would read these as, in fact, predecessors of Jesus. They're not alluding to Jesus directly. They are, in fact, alluding obliquely to their hero and their savior. Here's another. This is a mosaic, and this comes from the mausoleum of a family known as the Iuli, the Julians, if you will. And it shows us an image of Apollo on his chariot. So there is, in fact, the horses and the chariot. You can see one of the wheels, and there you see this figure, this bearded figure. Young, actually, he's beardless, with these rays of light coming from his head, surrounded by grape leaves. Roman images, a Roman deity, and yet Christians would understand that as an image of Christ triumphant in the heavens. So they're conflating Apollo with Jesus Christ as a kind of solar deity. So, and the grape leaves are an allusion to the wine. And of course, that wine is an allusion to the Eucharist. That is the wine representing the body and the blood of Christ. Of course, to Catholics, that in the context of the Mass, those elements are transformed into the actual blood and body of Christ, which they imbibe in the central ceremony of the Christian faith. So, an image that a Roman might read as an image of Apollo, a Christian would understand it as an image of Jesus Christ. Another magnificent sarcophagus. This is from the 4th century, so this is a little bit later than the period of Constantine. And by now, there's this kind of open celebration of Christianity within the Roman Empire, the late Roman Empire. This is the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, and this comes from Rome from about 359. The body would, the carved body would be on the lid, and it's mostly gone. But there are inscriptions that tell us that Junius Bassus was a Christian, was an important man, obviously a very wealthy man if he was able to have a sarcophagus like this one carved. And what we see here are these scenes. Again, they look like Roman art, but they're not really Roman art. The themes here are the stories of the life of Christ. So the central image of that young boy standing there, seated on a throne, is an image of Jesus. And that's an image of Jesus talking to the priests in the temple. There is an image immediately below that of a young boy riding what looks like a diminutive horse or a little donkey. That's Christ entering into the city of Jerusalem before his passion, before he's actually murdered. There's an individual in the tree talking to him. So I think that's the story of Zacchaeus. To the left, you see an image of a nude male and a nude female between the tree, or on the opposite side of a tree, with a snake wrapped around that tree. Allusions, obviously, to Adam and Eve, and on and on. These are stories out of the Christian narrative, but also the Jewish narratives, conflated, merged, if you will, with late Roman art to tell the story now very publicly of the stories that mattered to the Christian community. This is an image of a young philosopher, a Roman image of a young philosopher. It's believed to have been interpreted as an image of the seated Christ. So again, that young Christ, more than likely speaking as a philosopher now, or a theologian, if you will, a man of the faith, to the Pharisees in the temple. So again, a Roman image from the late 4th century. By now, Christianity had become a legal religion and an important religion that was gaining a lot of influence within the Roman state. So Constantine, in some ways, had it both ways. He was perceived by many as a unifying emperor, a great leader, both military and moral leader in the Roman Empire. But he was also showing favors to the Christian community, and in some ways had the Christians in the bag, because he not only made the religion legal within the Roman Empire, eventually makes it the Roman state religion, replacing the religion of the ancient gods. Constantine clearly must have had such force and such power that he was able to take these inordinately grand leaps in restructuring Roman society. But he was also a great builder, and he, in the wake of his many predecessors, he also built on a grand scale. So we're looking at here a model, or a map, if you will, of the Roman Forum. And here's the Forum, the Capitoline Hill to the left, the other hills like the Palatine here to the south. And then here's the Flavian Amphitheater, or the Colosseum. And there are a couple of large constructions that come from the time of Constantine. Here, just along the edges of the Via Sacra, along the Roman Forum, nearby the Colosseum. The Temple of Venus in Rome is identified with the reign of Constantine, as is this very, very large basilica. And that's the building that I want to show you. So rather than building fora like his predecessors had done before, Trajan and Augustus, et cetera, what he built was an enormous basilica, and he built temples. Here, in this case, a temple to Venus and to the city of Rome, the goddess of the city of Rome. And this is what is known as the Basilica Nova, or the Basilica of Constantine and Maxentius. Some people believe that both Constantine and Maxentius were worshipped here as divine rulers, in which case, what kind of a Christian king or Christian emperor would do that? Continue to have a cult that deified him, saw him as a deity. And it's possible that, in fact, in this liminal time during his reign, there were, in fact, Christians who tolerated this, and many probably didn't. The idea that the king saw himself as a divinity and allowed a cult to develop around his personality. Here's the basilica itself as it appears today, right off the Roman Forum. It's a grand building. And by the way, it has led some recent scholars to argue, and they're finding a lot of archaeological evidence for this, that this wasn't a temple at all, or a basilica at all, that this was in fact a bath. And of course, that would be in keeping with recent emperors like Diocletian, who built grand baths for the Roman people. In this case, this would have been the central bath of the Roman Forum. A very, very interesting idea. And there are, in fact, archaeologists working on that notion today, trying to find out what evidence there is for hydraulics here, that is the movement of water into a facility as grand as this one. And there you see, in fact, the Basilica Nova as it appeared in antiquity, not unlike the architecture that we saw at the baths of Diocletian and other predecessors. And presumably this is where that large colossal statue of Constantine came. It came from this site. So again, it would have been a seated effigy of him at the apse, at the very end of this incredible basilica, which dates from about 306 to 312. There's another monument not far away from there at the very end of the Roman Forum, and this is the Arch of Constantine. And I mentioned earlier that this was erected during the reign of Constantine. This is dedicated in 315 near the Colosseum, but it's a pastiche. It is in fact composed of various parts that come from different rulers. So what more than likely happened is that Constantine gathered together some of the finer, or his people did, gathered together some of the more fine remnants of earlier arches, earlier monuments from earlier rulers, and composed them into this very magnificent archway to celebrate Constantine, the new emperor. So what you see here in green are in fact parts that were carved during the reign of Constantine. They are reliefs, they attest to, or inscriptions that attest to Constantine, and then there are other recycled parts. So the yellow panels that you see here come from the rule of Marcus Aurelius. These purple panels that you see here from the period of Hadrian. In fact, these are Hadrianic stories. And there are elements here at the very top, these engaged or these pilasters that date from the rule of Trajan. All of these parts were recycled, and all the images on these earlier parts were carved to look like Constantine, which is a fabulous erasure, if you will, of his important predecessors. So we talked about these roundels that are in fact from the period of Emperor Hadrian, that tell the story of Hadrian worshiping and traveling across his empire. And these were the likeness of Hadrian was changed so that it looked like Constantine. And then the panels that you see below are indeed from the time of Constantine. And I just want you to just note the quality of the carving here, the period of Constantine, versus the quality of the period of the carving here during the time of Hadrian. There really is no comparison. We have seen the devolution, if you will, of Roman figurative art from the period of Hadrian to the time of Constantine. This work down here can't even compare. It has lost its three-dimensionality. It's lost its fortitude, if you will, as naturalistic art. So that is happening in the visual arts as these monuments are being erected. But the interesting thing is that it didn't matter to the Romans. They got the message. The message is that Constantine is the new guy in town, and he can have whatever monuments he wants, even at the expense of the monuments of earlier individuals. Constantine, as I mentioned, was a builder, and he built a number of important structures throughout Rome. This one was outside of Rome on the Vatican Hill on the other side of the Tiber River. And this is a church, and this is a Christian church. And you'll notice from the diagram up above and the plan on the left and the cross section here in the lower part of this image that this was a basilica, a very, very, very large basilica. And this is the most ancient structure of St. Peter's on the Vatican Hill. So the building that is there today is a Renaissance Baroque construction. It dates from the late 15th, early 16th centuries and continues on for the next 100 years. It's a modern building. The ancient basilica built by Constantine was torn down in order for that building to be built in the Renaissance. And this is apparently a gift of Constantine to the Christian church. According to many people, it is believed that it was here underneath in an ancient cemetery that dated back to the time of Nero, when in fact Nero had a circus here on the Vatican Hill, that Peter, the first Christian pope, was in fact buried here. And so underneath the altar, there is this myth that the bones of St. Peter were laid to rest. And therefore, this church was a gift, was built above the tomb of St. Peter's, and it was in fact the first church of St. Peter's on the Vatican Hill, a very, very important pilgrimage site for Christians in antiquity. So a gift from Constantine to the Christian church in Rome. And if you want to have a sense of what that church may have looked like, you don't have to go far, because there are in fact buildings that date to the 3rd, the 4th, 5th century in Rome today. And some of these were indeed Christian churches. This is in fact a church dedicated to Santa Sabina, an early Christian martyr. And this is in Rome today. You can visit this, this marvelous church. And this dates from about 422 to 32. So it is in fact a 5th century church, built very much in the style of the 4th century Church of St. Peter's. So a long hall with a flat roof, pitched roof above that, but flat on the inside, clerestory windows left and right, an arcade of columns, in this case Corinthian columns, and then side aisles. And that's a typical plan for a Roman basilica. And of course, at the end of a Roman basilica, you typically have an apse, that is a semicircular space. In Roman days, when the pagan gods were worshipped, there might have been an effigy of a deified emperor or a god, Zeus, Minerva, whomever. In Christian times, that becomes the important focal point of the Christian ceremony, and therefore you have a table. Because what at the heart of the Christian ceremony is the Mass, which is in fact a meal. It is in fact a meal in which the Christian community gathers to remember, to evoke the last meal, the Last Supper of Christ and his followers, his disciples in Jerusalem. And of course, for the Catholic community, it is the important moment when the elements of the bread and the wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ, which then is imbibed or eaten by the devotees. So this is an early Christian church. The imagery is Christian, but the type of building that we have here is in fact a Roman building. Okay, so I want to mention quickly that Constantine himself may not have been a real Christian or a true Christian. I mean, we don't really know for sure. But we do know that family members were. His mother, Helena, also becomes a saint, and she was the wife of Constantius Chlorus and the mother of Constantine. Constantius Chlorus divorced her, but nevertheless, she was still Constantine's mother. And we know that in 325, she went to Jerusalem. Anecdotally, apparently she visited the sites that were all important in the life of Jesus Christ. Visited and in fact endowed churches there to preserve those sites. And apparently she built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that is the sepulchre where supposedly the body of Christ lay, the Church of the Nativity, where supposedly Christ, well, I don't know if Christ actually wasn't born there clearly, but there's a church that celebrates Christ's Nativity. And Helena's pilgrimage was recorded in the time of Constantine. Here's an image, again, a much later image from the 16th century. So this is a modern image from Albania. This is the Church of St. Mary in Albania, in Berta, Albania. And it's an image of Constantine on the right, Constantine on the left, and Helena, his mother, on the right, and between them, the cross. And supposedly, Helena found the cross of Jesus in the 4th century, brought it back to Rome, and now there are many, many places where in Western Europe where you can find fragments of that cross that Saint Helena found. Constantine's daughter apparently was a fervent Christian. There is a church which was apparently dedicated to Santa Costanza, and this is a church that apparently Constantine gave his daughter. For a while, it may have been her own private chapel, and it is a marvelous building from the 4th century. It is in fact a circular or a radially planned building. It's a lovely, lovely building. Much of the columns are still there, the walls are still there. Much of the ornamentation is gone from the dome and the vaulting. All the plasterwork and the mosaics that once covered this are gone. But there are very, very important remnants still here that allude to the sumptuous ornament at the time of Constantine. First of all, let me just show you the structure of the building. Again, it's like a donut. with a series of double columns in the center, a dome over that, and then this kind of ambulatory, the circular donut-like space that surrounds it with a barrow vault above it. There is an entryway, a narthex here that you can see on the right side of the diagram, and you enter it, and then you're in this marvelous circular space with light coming down from that dome over the altar area in the middle of the room. Very unusual and wonderful. It's an ancient temple type now being repurposed or reused, the type used for a Christian church. What is really remarkable is not so much, well, the structure is remarkable in many, many levels. But what's remarkable are the remnants of the mosaics that surround this barrow vault, this donut. And let me show you some of those details. There you see some of it. This is all mosaic work dating from the time of Constantine. And it shows us really amazing imagery. Circular tandi surrounded by garlands of flowers and plants, grapevines with birds and little amorini, little angelic figures surrounding them. And then wonderful images of the processing of the making of grape. Here you see, in fact, the harvesting of grape, bringing the grape back from the vineyards, stomping of the grapes here to make the wine. Of course, the wine is important because it is the central symbol of the Christian faith. It is the blood of Christ, the sacrifice, a symbol of the sacrifice of Christ for humanity. So here's a detail, a vignette of a figure bringing the grapes in from the countryside. Again, marvelous allusions to the Roman world, recognizable to all Romans. All of the imagery that we see here, the birds, the angelic figures, the butterflies, etc. All of these are symbols, are images common to the Roman world, especially the aristocratic Roman world, but here repurposed with cleverly hidden, or actually now overt images, allusions to the Christian faith. A remarkable, remarkable place in early Christian history. So I mentioned that Constantine moves the capital, and this was a kind of heretical thing. First of all, he establishes Christianity as a legal religion. Then he makes it the state religion. And then he does what is unthinkable. He decides to move the capital away from Rome to a new city in the eastern part of the empire, in Byzantium. So what is now modern day Turkey. So, and then renames that city, that new capital, Constantinople. That would be tantamount to somebody removing, shifting the capital from Washington, D.C. in the United States to Florida or California or Texas, to the most improbable place. And yet it made sense. Apparently it made sense politically for Constantine to leave Rome and its history behind and leave the power structure there and to create his own new power structure and new seat of power in the eastern part, in the very, very wealthy and important eastern part of the empire. And of course, where he builds his new capital was an ancient town known as Byzantium, an ancient Greek town, and it was at the edges of Asia. So it was on travel roads. It was between the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea, between Europe on the one hand and Asia on the other. And that becomes, in fact, his new seat of power. And he rules there for the last 7 years of his life in Constantinople. Here are some images that acknowledge, in fact, this new relationship that he has with the East. On the left, we have an ivory plaque, and it shows us, and this is a later work, but it shows us, in fact, seated Constantine on his throne. Again, it's that new kind of flattish, not very good style. Nevertheless, it carries forth the message of Constantine as this new emperor holding the scepter with the eagle. And then behind him, you have symbolic allegorical figures. On the left hand, you have a figure with this kind of interesting crown. That is the city of Constantinople. She is, in fact, an allegory of the new city. On the right, a cameo showing Constantinople, the city, blessing him by crowning him. So we have a kind of Augustan type. He looks like Caesar Augustus, a kind of youthful figure, being crowned by a female figure who is the allegory of the city of Constantinople. And by the way, we know that it's a city, that she represents a city, because the crowns that these allegories wear is in fact a set of city walls. So that's what you see this female figure wearing here in the cameo and also there in the ivory plaque. Okay, and let me just show you where Constantinople is. So in the image on the left, what you have in the upper part is the Black Sea. And of course, that's a very, very large body of water, an inland body of water. And there is, in fact, a strait that allows the Black Sea to connect to the Sea of Marmara, which then ultimately connects with the Mediterranean. On the left side, that little isthmus that you see there is, in fact, the last piece of Europe before you hit Asia. On the other side of the straits is, in fact, the Asian continent. At least that's how that's the way people saw it back in the 4th century. This very important location between where these two large land masses meet across the straits is, in fact, where there was once an ancient Greek town known as Byzantium. And Byzantium was here on this little spit that you see there at the very bottom in the Sea of Marmara, at the very bottom of the straits. And so that is, in fact, the place, the location where Constantine would build his new capital. And here you see that little projection. This is the Sea of Marmara to the south, and this is the site of ancient Byzantium. It is where the new Rome will be built, and this is, in fact, Constantinople. Today, it is known as Istanbul. And then across the Golden Horn, this body of water here, this little body of water, you have another town known as Pera. It is now a part of Istanbul, but back then it was a small town on the other side. And there was Chrysopolis on the other side of the Bosphorus or the Straits, another Greek town on the other side, on the Asian side of the Straits. There were other towns nearby. Here's ancient Chalcedon as we call it today. But this is the place where Constantine will build the new capital. And this is what he would see actually from his place. Actually, he would see the modern city, but this was where the site of Pera was, opposite the Golden Horn. This is modern day Istanbul today. Again, this is a view of the bridge that connects the two today. Of course, there was no bridge here in ancient times. Istanbul is a marvelous, marvelous city. It lives up to its reputation as a crossroads of Asia and Europe. It is an amazing, amazing place. And it goes back to not just Constantine, it goes back to the Greeks before that. And there were many, many other peoples who inhabited these lands. But here you see, in fact, what Constantine did to create his new capital. So the ancient Byzantium was here on this little spit. And then Constantine will build a set of walls here. Later emperors, known as the Byzantine emperors, because they're no longer Roman emperors, they're Christian emperors. They're known as the Byzantine emperors. They will build, Theodosius will build another set of walls back here. So this is, in fact, the location, the important location of the ancient Constantinople. And here are some of the walls. I can't remember if these are the walls of Theodosius or the walls of Constantine, but there are still large stretches of the walls of these ancient Roman and Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. So here's a reconstruction of that view. There's Pera on the other side of the Golden Horn, and then here is the city proper. And I don't know if we can make out the walls here. Oh, there they are in the distance, the walls of Constantine, and then the walls of Theodosius in the far distance. And then the palace, the royal palace, was located down here. There was also a hippodrome, a circus. There were all kinds of amenities, just like you had in ancient Rome, only now new versions in Constantinople. Here's a French map showing us that all-important, the royal palace right next to the hippodrome or the Circus Maximus. And then there were also a number of churches that were built here, Christian churches. They will eventually be replaced, by the way, by Muslim mosques in the 15th century and later times when the Muslims conquered the city from the Byzantine emperors, the Christian emperors. But the underlying layer of Constantinople is indeed Roman, and it dates back to the time of Constantine the Great. This is the Church of Saint Irene. which is in the ancient city. And of course, today, by the way, this is a concert hall. In earlier times, the Muslims used it as a horse stable. They stored armaments here. They desacralized it as a Christian church, obviously. But the architecture from the exterior still holds true to what was built in the time of Constantine. This is one of the Egyptian obelisks that, and remember that the Circus Maximus in Rome had Egyptian obelisks down its spina, down the central spine of the, and the charioteers would of course go around these monuments. That was true in Constantinople as well, in the Hippodrome that was adjacent to the royal palace, the Constantine's palace. Let's see, this is actually the setting of that obelisk that was brought here for the new capital, and therefore the reliefs that you see down below date to the time of Constantine, and it's basically his court. There are wonderful images of the emperor in his viewing booth and the crowds watching the events in the Hippodrome or the Circus Maximus. This is the very bottom, the base of that. And again, you see the charioteers down below, much like they would have been seen in ancient Constantinople. There's some details. It's a much abraded image. It was buried for many centuries and now sort of re-exposed in modern times. This is part of the royal palace. This is the Boukoleon Palace, which is down on the shore. And these are the windows that overlooked the ancient Constantinian windows that overlooked the Sea of Marmara on the southern end of the city. So here is the Boukoleon Palace, and these walls, those windows are on the walls, the protective walls of that palace overlooking the Sea of Marmara. So it was a very sophisticated and beautiful city. It still is, by the way, but you can imagine what it must have been like in the time of the Roman emperors now living here. And I might add that the importance of this for Rome is also very, it's significant. The fact that Constantine took the tax base, the whole imperial superstructure, and moved it here meant that Rome becomes a backwater, that Rome proper, that most ancient city that for 500 years was the imperial, the capital of this vast and important empire, would then be languishing without the power structure, without the taxes, without the leadership that it needed from the royal court. So Rome becomes a backwater, and then it becomes rife for the picking of Rome's enemies in the West. So that's another story. And by the way, I do recommend that you read Gibbon's The Fall of the Roman Empire. It is still the classic. It is still the book that seriously addresses why Rome collapses. And Constantine plays an enormous role in the collapse of the Roman Empire. And moving the capital here, the embrace of Christianity, are important elements in that ultimate collapse of Rome. The Boukoleon Palace and the royal palace are still there in fragments, in ruins. They have not been excavated because if you imagine, for the last 500 years, the city has been ruled by Muslim leaders who had very little interest in Roman or pagan history or early Christian history here. And so, so these sites are still there, and you can see them in part. For example, there's a fabulous mosaic museum in Istanbul today. You can visit that, and there you will see the actual pavements of the royal palace, the floors, and they're exquisite. The mosaic floors of that royal palace of the early Christian emperors who ruled here. And again, remember, these are 4th century and 5th century emperors who thought that they were ruling like good Romans, but they were all Christian. And so they are known as the Byzantine emperors, the early Byzantine emperors. They're no longer called Roman emperors. But they still lived with the finery and the splendor of their ancient Roman pagan predecessors. Here's some details, again, more details of the floors, of the dining rooms, the apartments, the symposia, the gathering spaces of the important rulers here. And it's ultimately that Roman art that will lead to this art we call Byzantine art. So this is a magnificent mosaic of Jesus Christ. And this can be found on the second story of the Church of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul today. So this is a Christian image in the Church of Hagia Sophia. And again, it continues that tradition that goes back to the Roman emperors and obviously their predecessors before the emergence of the Byzantine emperors. Istanbul still has in its museums many allusions to that ancient Roman and Christian world. These are images of the Good Shepherd. And these, of course, were very popular with Christians because Christ is seen as a good shepherd. And of course, we saw that in Rome, and we're also likely to see it here in Constantinople as well. So this is, in fact, the world as we see it. And I want to show you this image, how far Rome is from Constantinople. Constantinople is here on the edge of Asia, above Asia Minor, which is now modern day Turkey, or ancient Anatolia as it was known. Constantine from here had access to the Black Sea and Central Europe, as far north as Russia, had access to Mesopotamia and the Near East, had access through the Sea of Marmara to the Ionic Sea over here to the Hellenic Isles and to Greece, and then obviously Egypt and the rest of the Mediterranean. But Rome had lost its place. It had lost its stature. It had lost its significance with the move of the empire, the seat of power, to Constantinople. So, and it was from there that the Byzantine emperors ruled. That is, those Christian emperors who ruled in the tradition of Roman emperors. So the Byzantine Empire is a mixture, if you will, of Roman, Christian, and Greek influences because of its proximity to the Greek world there at the edges of Asia. And then, of course, it also has lots of contact and lots of trade with the East. So all of those ancient religions, all of those ancient civilizations of Central Asia and Mesopotamia, Egypt, etc., all of that flows now to and through Constantinople. So the Eastern Church, that is what we call the Orthodox Church, will also be centered in Constantinople. And that is where the patriarchs of the church are. Its cult of the saints, its proselytizing monks and nuns and orders would emerge from Constantinople and diffuse throughout the eastern part of the former Roman Empire. So the Byzantine Empire replaces Rome in the east, and it becomes the heirs into modern times of the Roman Empire in the east. But there is, in fact, a rift between that Eastern Empire and its orthodoxy and the Western Empire, which is still based in Rome. And that empire, of course, languishes, collapses in the 5th century. And then Europe is plunged into what we call the Middle Ages. And this history is, in fact, separate and distinct from Roman history, but also separate and distinct from Byzantine history. So again, let me just take you back to this map, and it shows us, in fact, the administrative districts of the world, the provinces, if you will, at the time of Constantine. But the power base in the Roman Empire shifts east, away from Rome. And the emperors there will continue to rule. The Byzantine emperors will continue to rule as if they were the legitimate Roman emperors, the legitimate heirs of Constantine and the Roman emperors before them. And they will create an art, which is a Christian art, that is spun off or derived from the late Roman art. So this is an image of Justinian, a very, very important 6th century ruler in the Byzantine Empire, seen on horseback. So this is an equestrian figure, toppling his enemies, defeating his enemies in battle. And above him, though, we have an image of a young Christ. So he is now ruling under the auspices, the protection, if you will, of a new deity. And that is, of course, Christ. Not so new by the 5th century, by the 6th century, but still an important, a new Zeus, a new deity, a protective deity for these emperors. Here's a detail of that scene. And then the genie, the former figures of Nike, victorious, are now transformed into Christian angels. surrounding Christ, blessing the Emperor Justinian. Justinian was a great builder in his own right. And so in the 6th century, I want to show you some of the constructions that are identified with his rule, his and his wife's, very important wife's rule. This is the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. This is in Italy. This is actually off on the Adriatic coast of Italy, kind of at the calf of the Italian boot. And this is a marvelous site if you're interested in these 6th century Byzantine mosaics. And again, the architecture here is continuous with ancient Roman architecture. So we see this continuing in Italy. So it is, and there's the red brick, the vaulting, etc., very similar to the things that for centuries have developed in Rome and its empire. Here's the plan. It's an octagonal church with an apse at one end. You enter through the narthex here on the left, and then you are in this fabulous radial space, if you will, with their own vaults above the whole thing and a very large dome over the thing. And then there's an altar area in this apse. And let me show you what that interior looks like. It is fantastic. I mean, it is just marvelous. Beautiful panels of revetted marbles on the walls, beautiful carved columns, lots and lots of Christian imagery like these lambs holding crosses, and then mosaics, fantastic mosaics that take us back to the 6th century, the time of the Byzantine emperors. Remember, they rule from Constantinople, but they sometimes come back to Rome, and they have to pass through Ravenna to get there. And by the way, you can ignore these Baroque 17th and 18th century frescoes up above. Those are much, much later, a little bit over the top in my opinion, but nevertheless, they seem to work with the earlier architecture. Okay, this is the altar of the Church of San Vitale, and there is the apse, which signals the altar, the altar table for the Christian Mass, and then above it an image of Christ as the triumphal ruler of the universe, surrounded by angels and attendant figures. And then that imagery carries on all the way up into the vaulting, where you have an image of the Lamb of God at the very top. And remember, this is late, very, 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 very late Roman art. The devolution, or the evolution, let's call it that now, of Roman art into Byzantine art. There are images of Emperor Justinian, and there we see him on the left of the altar, bearing gifts, surrounded by his court, and actually surrounded by the court of Bishop Maximianus and his attendants here. And again, here's a wonderful allusion to the cross to Constantine, because here on the shield you have the monogram of Jesus, the Chi Rho, the two Greek letters that represent Jesus the Christ. An allusion to the important shields of Constantine's victories. This is the Emperor Justinian, and this is his wife Theodora. Again, amazing biographies in their own right. We won't cover them here in this course. They deserve a course of their own. But these are the Byzantine emperors as represented in the Western Empire. So here in Italy, in Ravenna, Italy. Okay, and then I want to end by looking at a construction that also dates from the time of Justinian and Theodora. And this is the most important and impressive building in all of Istanbul today. And this is the Church of Hagia Sophia. It is today, by the way, it is now being used as a mosque. For most of the 20th century, it was used as a museum. For the last 500 years, it has been a place of worship for the Islamic faith. And prior to that, it was a Christian church going back to the year 532. This is the impressive monumental church of Hagia Sophia, or Saint Sophia, Holy Sophia, Holy Wisdom. You have to visually remove the minarets that you see here. These are towers that were built by Muslim architects, and these are where the muezzin call the Muslims to prayer 5 times a day. So they climb these minarets, and from there they call the devotees to pray. Those were not a part of the original Christian church. They were added later, as were some of the buttresses that you see here along the sides of the original massing of the building. But there are elements of this architecture that should be familiar to us. very large dome at the top, which obviously evokes the Pantheon, Hadrian's Pantheon in Rome. These vaults, the kind of the massing of the building itself, and its internal spaces as well. We'll look at those shortly. So think of this as the building that goes back to those early Byzantine emperors in the century after Constantine ruled in his capital city. So this is in some ways the flowering, if you will, of Constantinian architecture and Constantinian values in this place. This is a little, well, actually, let's start with the image down below that shows us the evolution of this building. This is the earliest building that you see here, and this was built as a basilica. And remember the basilica that Constantine built on the Vatican Hill as a gift to the Christian community? Well, he'll build something comparable, or well, later emperors will build something comparable in Constantinople. So we had a basilica. That building burned to the ground, and then this building, which is the one that you see here, was built later. And this is the important building that is still there today. An earthquake brought down its original dome, and then it was rebuilt with the dome that we see today. It's a miracle this very, very heavy structure is still around today. But this is its form as it looked in the time of Justinian in the 6th century. And on that note, actually, here's again a view of that original building. And inside, it's somewhat of a disappointment because a lot of those Byzantine mosaics have been covered over. They were plastered over in the 15th century when the Muslims occupied or took possession of the city, and it has been in Muslim possession ever since. In part, you can still see some of those mosaics today, although the current regime is actually doing everything possible or making it virtually impossible to see the mosaics. But they're there. And in fact, underneath all the plasterwork, there are lots of these Byzantine mosaics that date back to the time of Justinian and his successors. So on that note, we will end our conversation about the Roman Empire. And thank you very, very much for taking part in this discussion. I invite you to share these videos, all 13 of them, with your friends. Remind them that there's a good course on Roman art and architecture on YouTube. So just follow me. I will hopefully be doing some more of these courses, maybe not as long as this one, but I will continue to do these and post them for you. So thanks again, and until the next one, adios.